The flight attendant thought she could humiliate him however she wanted. Sarcastic remarks, petty jabs, and even a slap that left everyone stunned. But when hundreds of lives were suddenly at stake, everything changed. She discovered who he really was, but by then it was far too late. What happened next made her regret every single action. But let's start from the beginning. At 6 a.m., Atlanta's airport was already buzzing with its usual chaos. Ronald Jackson, a 38-year-old black man in a crisp navy blue suit, rolled his carry-on toward the gate for his business-class flight to Los Angeles. Exhaustion weighed on him after a long night of work, and all he wanted was to sink into his seat, close his eyes, and pretend the world didn't exist for a few hours. When he reached the boarding gate, he spotted Sharon Whitaker, a blonde flight attendant with a plastic-perfect smile. Her friendly expression vanished the moment her eyes locked on Ronald, replaced by a look of thinly veiled suspicion. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path with a practiced, polite authority. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "This is a business-class boarding line. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Ronald blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied calmly, pulling out his ticket and holding it up. Sharon's eyes flicked to the ticket, then back to Ronald. Her lips curled into a condescending smirk. "Well, isn't that interesting," she said with a fake chuckle. "This looks like a business-class ticket, but I have to ask, where did you get it? Did someone give it to you?" Ronald's patience began to wear thin. "Ma'am, I purchased this ticket, passed through security, and followed all the same procedures as everyone else. Please let me board." But Sharon didn't budge. Instead, she laughed lightly, looking around as if inviting the other passengers to share in the joke. "Business class, huh? You sure you didn't take this from someone else? No offense, but you don't exactly fit the picture." Ronald's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "If you have an issue with my ticket, feel free to call security. Otherwise, step aside and let me through." Her smirk dropped instantly, replaced by a flush of anger. Before anyone could react, Sharon raised her hand and slapped him hard across the face. Gasps rippled through the line as every head turned toward them. "Get out of here before I call the police," she snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. For a moment, Ronald stood frozen, stunned by her audacity. The sting on his cheek was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in his chest. But just as he opened his mouth to respond, Captain Henriksen, the pilot, arrived. "What's going on here?" Henriksen asked, his gruff voice cutting through the tension. Sharon handed him the ticket without a word, her lips pressed into a tight line. The captain examined it briefly, then handed it back to Ronald with a nod. "The ticket's valid," he said simply. "Let him through." Sharon's face tightened, but she stepped aside reluctantly. Ronald adjusted his tie, nodded at the captain, and walked past without saying a word. Inside, he felt the weight of every judgmental stare as he made his way to his seat. Sitting down, Ronald gazed out the window, trying to push the incident out of his mind. But the slap, the accusations, and the indignity of it all lingered like a bad aftertaste. Little did he know this flight was about to take a much darker and more unexpected turn. Ronald settled into his seat, letting out a quiet sigh as he adjusted his tie and leaned back. He thought the worst was behind him. Maybe, just maybe, the rest of the flight would be uneventful. But Sharon Whitaker clearly had other plans. She swept through the aisle like a hawk circling its prey, her sharp heels clicking against the floor. Every time she passed Ronald, she seemed to make a point of bumping into him with her elbow, her tray, or anything else she was carrying. It wasn't subtle, and it definitely wasn't accidental. Ronald kept his cool, but his grip on the armrest tightened with every unnecessary nudge. "Excuse me, miss," he said calmly during one of her many walk-bys. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" Sharon didn't even glance at him. She breezed right past, muttering something under her breath that he couldn't quite catch. But he was pretty sure it wasn't, "Of course, sir." A few minutes later, she returned with the drink orders for the rest of the row. Ronald waited patiently as she served the passengers on either side of him. But when it came to him, she skipped him altogether. "Miss," said a middle-aged man seated across the aisle, "you skipped him. He asked for water earlier." Sharon turned to the man with a cold, practiced smile. "I don't believe that's any of your concern, sir," she said smoothly. then walked away before anyone could respond. Ronald clenched his jaw, his patience hanging by a thread. But the tipping point came during the meal service. Sharon slammed a tray of food down on his table with enough force to send half the sauce spilling onto his neatly pressed suit. "Seriously?" Ronald muttered, staring at the stains spreading across his jacket. The man across the aisle couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Hey, miss," he snapped. "What is your problem? You've been targeting this guy since the boarding gate." Sharon's smile vanished. "Sir, I don't know what you're talking about," she replied curtly. "Please stay out of matters that don't involve you." "It involves everyone when you're acting like this," the man shot back, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Before things could escalate further, the plane jolted violently, cutting through the tension with a sudden burst of turbulence. Ronald instinctively grabbed the armrests as the cabin lights flickered. Sharon, who had been mid-retort, stumbled and caught herself against a seat. The turbulence grew worse, the plane shaking as if it were being tossed around like a toy. Passengers began murmuring nervously, their voices quickly rising into panicked chatter. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear, a high-pitched alarm followed by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical issue. Please remain calm and seated while we assess the situation." The cabin erupted into chaos. Sharon tried to shout over the noise, but her voice barely carried above the rising panic. Meanwhile, Ronald unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, scanning the cabin for any sign of what was happening. "Sir, sit down immediately," Sharon barked, rushing toward him. "I knew it. I knew you were trouble the moment I saw you. This is probably your fault." Ronald gave her a flat look, but he didn't waste time arguing. He turned and headed toward the back of the plane where the emergency systems were located. "Hey!" Sharon shouted, chasing after him. "You can't just... If you don't sit down right now, I'll have security waiting for you when we land." Ronald ignored her, his focus locked on the task at hand. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, their confusion growing with every step he took. Before Sharon could grab his arm, the captain's voice came back on the intercom. This time it sounded much more urgent. "Attention passengers, we are dealing with a critical issue affecting flight safety. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions. I repeat, this is a serious situation." The air in the cabin grew heavy with fear as everyone realized just how dire the situation had become. All eyes were on Ronald now, as he reached the emergency access panel at the back of the plane. What he did next would either save them all or cement the doubts Sharon had planted in their minds. Ronald didn't hesitate. The moment he reached the emergency systems panel, he opened it with practiced precision, his hands moving confidently across switches and wires. Passengers craned their necks to watch, their murmurs a mix of confusion and fear. "What's he doing? Can he even be back there?" someone whispered. One of the flight crew members, a young technician, rushed toward Ronald. His face was pale, his steps uncertain. "Sir, you're not supposed to... What are you doing?" Without pausing, Ronald replied, "I'm an aeronautical engineer. You've got a problem with your fuel stabilization system. Let me fix it, or this plane's in serious trouble." The technician froze, unsure whether to stop him or help. "You're an engineer?" 15 years in the field," Ronald said quickly. "Now grab the secondary panel on the left. See the blinking light? That's your backup valve misaligned. I'll stabilize the main line while you reroute the flow." The technician, still unsure, followed his instructions. Ronald worked quickly, his movements precise and efficient. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers watched in silence, their earlier whispers replaced by hopeful, desperate gazes. From the aisle, Sharon stood frozen. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by disbelief. "He's fixing the plane," she muttered under her breath, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding in front of her. "Who is this guy?" someone asked. Minutes felt like hours. The plane jolted again, and passengers gasped, clutching their armrests. Ronald didn't flinch. "Focus," he said sharply to the technician. "We're almost there." Finally, the alarm stopped. The lights stabilized. The plane steadied in the air. A moment later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the technical issue has been resolved. We are no longer in danger. Please remain seated as we monitor the situation. Thank you." For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then, A wave of applause erupted, passengers clapping and cheering. Relief washed over the cabin as smiles and laughter replaced fear. Ronald stepped back from the panel, brushing his hands on his suit. Without looking at anyone, he walked back to his seat, his expression calm. Sharon hesitated, then followed him. Her hands shook as she approached, her face pale. I'm so sorry, she stammered. I was wrong about you. I shouldn't have treated you like that. Ronald looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, without saying a word, he sat down and gazed out the window. By the time the plane landed, news of Ronald's actions had spread. Passengers shared the story online, calling him a hero. The airline issued a public apology and awarded Ronald lifetime VIP status. Sharon, however, faced public backlash and quietly resigned. As for Ronald, he stayed true to himself, letting his actions speak louder than words. How would you have handled the situation if you were in Ronald's place? Do you think staying calm and composed was the best approach, or would you have confronted the injustice head-on? Share your thoughts, comment below, and let us know if you or someone you know has experienced anything similar. Don't forget to like this post and spread awareness. Your voice matters. This story was created to highlight an important issue and inspire positive change. Together we can shine a light on these problems and work toward making the world a better place. Your opinion truly makes a difference.